Deep in the heart of Appalachia, where towering mountains scrape the sky and ancient forests hold secrets darker than midnight, there once lived a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of wild beasts and hardened mountain folk alike. This is the story of a 13-year-old boy who walked alone into a wilderness so savage that grown men refused to set foot there, no matter how much gold they were offered. A place where panthers screamed through the darkness and bears ruled like kings of an untamed kingdom. But what drives a child to leave everything behind and venture into certain death? What kind of man emerges from such a crucible? The answers lie buried in the hills of Virginia, in a tale so extraordinary that it reads like legend, yet every word rings true. This is the story of Fighting Dick Colley, and by the time we're finished, you'll understand why his name was once spoken in the same breath as Daniel Boone himself. Picture America in the year 1806. The young nation was barely 2 decades old, still finding its footing after winning independence from the British Crown. With no foreign king to hold them back, pioneers pushed relentlessly westward, crossing the mighty Appalachian Mountains like a human tide, seeking fortune and freedom. These weren't your ordinary settlers, mind you. These were men and women forged from iron and grit, folks who looked at impossible odds and laughed in their faces. Among these ambitious souls were wealthy investors who saw opportunity where others saw only wilderness. They purchased massive tracts of untamed land, sometimes hundreds of thousands of acres at a time, betting their fortunes on America's future. But owning land on paper was one thing. Protecting it from squatters and claim jumpers was quite another. That's where our story begins, with a businessman named Andrew Hebern, who had just made what many considered the worst investment in Virginia's history. Hebern had purchased nearly 400,000 acres of virgin wilderness, straddling the Kentucky-Virginia border, a place locals called the Sandy Basin. To put that in perspective, we're talking about almost 600 square miles of untouched forest, an area larger than some entire states. But this wasn't just any wilderness. The Sandy Basin sat in the shadow of Pine Mountain, walled in by granite cliffs that reached toward heaven itself. It formed a natural bowl of thick, unbroken forest where sunlight barely penetrated even at midday. No white man had ever dared to venture into this cursed place, and the reasons were as clear as they were terrifying. The Sandy Basin was ruled by creatures that haunted the nightmares of even the bravest mountain men. Panthers prowled the laurel thickets, their screams echoing through the hollows like the cries of tormented souls. Black bears roamed freely, some standing over 7 feet tall when they reared up on their hind legs. Wolves moved in packs, their howls carrying for miles through the mountain air, and bobcats watched from the shadows with eyes that glowed like hot coals in the darkness. This was America's heart of darkness, a place where nature reigned supreme and death lurked behind every tree. Yet Hebern needed someone to live there, to protect his investment from the squatters who might be bold enough or foolish enough to try claiming his land. He placed advertisements in newspapers across Virginia, offering wages that would make a man wealthy. The response was immediate and unanimous. Not a single soul would take the job. Weeks turned to months, and still no one answered Hebern's call. The money didn't matter. The land didn't matter. What good were riches to a dead man? What use was wealth to someone whose bones would bleach white in some forgotten hollow, picked clean by the very beasts he was supposed to drive away? It seemed hopeless. The sandy basin would remain unconquered, its secrets locked away behind walls of stone and fear. But fate has a way of providing the most unlikely heroes when they're needed most. In a valley called Reed's Valley, on a 350-acre farm where the work never ended and the days blended into one long struggle for survival, lived a boy who was different from all the rest. His name was Dick Colley, and though he was only 13 years old, he possessed something that full-grown men lacked. He had the heart of a warrior and the soul of a pioneer. Dick wasn't your typical farm boy, not by any stretch of the imagination. While other children his age were learning their letters and helping with simple chores, Dick was already as big as most grown men. His shoulders were broad and square, his hands calloused from years of hard labor, and his eyes held a fire that spoke of adventures yet to come. But it wasn't just his size that set him apart. It was his absolute fearlessness, a quality so rare that it bordered on the supernatural. The blood of heroes flowed in Dick's veins. His father had been all but one of the legendary over-mountain men, those fierce fighters who had crossed the Appalachians to strike at the British during the Revolutionary War. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, Dick's father had stood shoulder to shoulder with other patriots, helping to deliver a crushing defeat to the enemy. These men were cut from different cloth, forged in the fires of war, and tempered by the harsh realities of frontier life. Dick had inherited more than just his father's blood. He possessed skills that would make seasoned woodsmen envious. He could track a deer through the thickest underbrush, following signs that others couldn't even see. His aim with a rifle was deadly accurate, and he moved through the forest as silently as morning mist. But perhaps most importantly, he could fight. And when Dick Colley fought, people took notice. The story that would cement his reputation happened at a corn shucking, one of those community gatherings where neighbors came together to help harvest the crop. These events were as much about socializing as they were about work, and it was common for the men to test their strength against one another. Wrestling matches and bare-knuckle fights were as much a part of the evening as the corn itself. On this particular night, a full-grown mountain man, the kind of fellow who made his living with his fists and feared no one, decided to test the mettle of the young Colley boy. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. The man landed several crushing blows to Dick's face, powerful punches that would have dropped most men cold. Dick hit the ground hard, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. The crowd gasped in horror. Someone in the gathering turned to Dick's father, shouting over the noise of the crowd. The concern in his voice was genuine, the fear real. Surely this had gone too far. Surely the boy's father would step in before his son was beaten to death. But Dick's father just chuckled, a sound that seemed out of place given the violence unfolding before them. He knew something the crowd didn't. He knew his son. What happened next defied belief. Dick sprang to his feet like a coiled spring suddenly released. His eyes blazed with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, some primal place where civilized men feared to tread. He landed one thunderous punch to the man's head, a blow so powerful that it knocked 2 teeth clean from the fellow's skull and laid him out cold on the ground. The crowd fell silent. In that moment, they witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. This wasn't just a boy anymore. This was Fighting Dick Colley, and his legend had just begun. Word of the fight spread like wildfire through the mountains. Folks began to whisper about the Colley boy, about his impossible strength and his fearless heart. Some said he was touched by something supernatural. Others claimed he was simply born for greater things than farming and ordinary life. As spring turned to summer in 1806, these whispers reached the ears of Andrew Hayburn. The businessman had all but given up hope of finding someone willing to oversee his Sandy Basin property. Then he heard about a boy who fought like a man, who feared nothing that walked on 2 legs or 4. It was a desperate gamble, but desperate times called for desperate measures. On the morning of June 3rd, 1806, something extraordinary happened. The door to Hayburn's office opened, and in walked a 13-year-old boy with the bearing of a seasoned frontiersman. Dick Colley looked the businessman straight in the eye and declared, plain as daylight, that he was the right man for the job. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his manner. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had already made his decision and was simply informing others of his intentions. The meeting was brief, terms were agreed upon, hands were shaken, and just like that, a boy's childhood came to an end. Dick returned home to say his goodbyes, though he knew in his heart that this might be the last time he saw his family alive. His mother wept as she kissed him farewell, her tears falling like rain on his weathered cheek. His father gripped his hand in a firm handshake, the kind exchanged between equals, between men who understood what it meant to face the unknown. Dick's possessions were few, but carefully chosen. He carried his trusty rifle, a weapon that had never failed him when his life depended on its accuracy. By his side trotted 2 hunting dogs, loyal companions who would share whatever fate awaited in the wilderness. He had a hunting knife sharp enough to shave with, a tomahawk balanced perfectly for throwing, and enough powder and shot to last through the first few weeks. Everything else he would have to provide for himself or do without. As Dick walked away from the only home he had ever known, heading toward a wilderness that had already claimed the lives of braver men than he, one question echoed through the mountains. Would this boy, this child with the heart of a warrior, survive where grown men had failed? The answer would determine not just his fate, but the destiny of an entire region. The Sandy Basin waited in silence, its ancient trees swaying in the wind like mourners at a funeral. Somewhere in those dark hollows, creatures with teeth and claws prepared for the arrival of their newest prey. They had no way of knowing that this time death was walking toward them on 2 legs, carrying a rifle and wearing the face of a boy who had already decided he would rather die fighting than live in fear. The legend of Fighting Dick Colley was about to begin, and the wilderness would never be the same. The summer of 1806 found Dick Colley standing at the edge of the known world, staring into a green abyss that stretched beyond the horizon. Behind him lay everything familiar, everything safe. Ahead waited the Sandy Basin, a realm where civilization ended and something far more primal began. The boy shouldered his rifle, whistled to his dogs, and stepped across the threshold into legend. The journey to his new domain took 3 days of hard travel through increasingly wild country. Each mile carried him further from the world of men and deeper into something that felt ancient beyond measure. The roads grew narrower, then became mere trails, then disappeared altogether. The sounds of human activity faded until all that remained was the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of creatures he couldn't name. On the third day, Dick crested a ridge and saw it spread before him like a vision from another world. The sandy basin opened up in all directions, a vast bowl of unbroken forest that seemed to pulse with its own dark heartbeat. Towering cliffs rose on every side, their granite faces scarred by centuries of wind and rain. Below, the canopy stretched unbroken, so thick and green that it swallowed light itself. This wasn't just wilderness. This was the earth as God had made it, before man had ever drawn breath. Dick chose his spot carefully, finding a small clearing near what locals called Sand Lick. Here, a natural spring bubbled up from the earth, providing the one thing no man could live without. The location offered other advantages too: high ground for defense, thick timber for building, and game trails that crisscrossed the area like highways through the forest. If he was going to survive in this place, he would need every advantage he could get. Building his cabin became an act of defiance against the wilderness itself. Dick felled massive chestnuts and oaks, trees so large that it took him hours to bring down each one. He notched and fitted the logs with the skill of a master craftsman, though he was still just 13 years old. The structure he created was unlike anything built by ordinary settlers. 3 walls of solid timber rose from the earth, with the 4th side left open to the elements. This wasn't an oversight or a sign of laziness. This was strategy. You see, Dick understood something that most folks didn't. In a place where death could come from any direction at any moment, you needed to be ready to fight or run at a second's notice. That open wall meant he could leap from his bed, grab his rifle, and be firing at attackers before they knew what hit them. It also meant he could escape if things went badly, melting into the forest like smoke before dawn. The first nights in that cabin tested every ounce of courage Dick possessed. As darkness fell, the sandy basin came alive with sounds that would have driven lesser men mad with fear. Panthers screamed from the ridges, their cries so human-like that they seemed to be calling his name. Wolves howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling like some unholy choir. Bears crashed through the underbrush, announcing their presence with grunts and snorts that echoed off the canyon walls. Dick learned to sleep with one eye open, his rifle always within arm's reach. His hunting knife stayed tucked under his pillow, ready to be drawn in an instant. His boots never came off, because he never knew when he might need to run for his life or stand and fight. The dogs slept beside him, their ears constantly twitching at sounds only they could hear. They were his early warning system, his first line of defense against the creatures that stalked the night. But Dick wasn't content to simply survive. Survival was for ordinary men, and Dick Colley was anything but ordinary. He set about making the wilderness his own, bending it to his will through sheer force of determination. He cleared a patch of ground near the cabin and planted it with everything he would need to sustain himself. Irish potatoes went into the rich mountain soil, along with onions that would help preserve his meat through the long winter months. Corn grew tall and strong in the mountain air, while cabbage and melons added variety to what would otherwise be a monotonous diet. For meat, Dick had only to step outside his door. The forest teemed with game of every description. Deer moved through the woods like ghosts, their white tails flashing as they bounded away from his approach. Wild turkeys strutted through the clearings, their bronze feathers gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Black bears wandered the hillsides, fattening themselves on berries and nuts. All of them became fair game for a boy who could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 paces. But hunting in the sandy basin wasn't like hunting anywhere else. This wasn't a matter of walking out with a rifle and coming back with supper. This was warfare, a constant battle between predator and prey where the roles could switch in the blink of an eye. Dick learned this lesson early, and he learned it hard. One morning, as fog rolled through the hollows like ghostly fingers, Dick set out tracking a young buck he'd spotted the day before. The trail led him along Dog Branch, a creek that wound through some of the thickest laurel he'd ever seen. His dogs, trained to perfection, followed the scent with their noses pressed to the ground. Everything seemed routine, just another hunt in what was becoming his daily routine. Then the dogs went crazy. Their barking changed from the steady rhythm of tracking to something wild and desperate. They'd found something in the laurel, something that didn't want to be found. Dick pushed through the undergrowth toward the sound, his rifle ready, expecting to find his dogs cornering the buck. What he found instead was a nightmare made flesh, a massive black bear, easily 6 feet tall at the shoulder, had turned on the dogs with the fury of something possessed. One hound already lay motionless in the leaves, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The bear's claws, each one as long as a man's finger, raked across the ribs of Dick's best dog, a faithful companion named Smoke. Blood sprayed across the laurel leaves as the animal's desperate yelps filled the air. Time slowed to a crawl. Dick saw everything with crystal clarity, the way men do when death comes calling. The bear's yellow teeth gleamed with saliva. Its small black eyes burned with primitive rage. Smoke, bleeding and broken, tried desperately to crawl away from those terrible claws. Without thinking, without hesitation, Dick raised his flintlock rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the mountains like thunder. The bear staggered, roared once more, and crashed to the forest floor. But Dick's victory came at a cost. Smoke lay dying in the bloody leaves, his breathing shallow and labored. Dick wrapped the wounded dog in his own hunting shirt and carried him 6 miles back to the cabin, cradling him like a child. For days he nursed Smoke back to health, feeding him by hand and tending his wounds with the tenderness of a mother. This was the kind of man Dick Colley was becoming. Deadly when he needed to be, gentle when gentleness was called for. The wilderness was shaping him, molding him into something new and extraordinary. Each day brought fresh challenges, new tests of his courage and skill. Some he passed with flying colors, others nearly cost him his life. The close call that would haunt his dreams for years to come happened on a crisp autumn evening near the mouth of Pound River. Dick had been following fresh sign all day, claw marks on trees and broken branches that told the story of the bear's passage. From the size of the marks, he judged it to be a young animal, maybe 2 years old, big enough to provide meat for the winter, but not so large as to be truly dangerous. He found his quarry near a rotting log, rummaging for grubs and insects. Dick crept closer, moving with the stealth that had become second nature. The bear was perfectly positioned, broadside to his rifle, an easy shot for someone of his skill. He raised the flintlock, drew a careful bead, and squeezed the trigger. The powder flashed in the pan but failed to ignite the main charge. A misfire, every hunter's nightmare. The bear looked up at the sound, saw Dick standing frozen in the open, and charged with the speed of a runaway horse. Dick had perhaps 3 seconds to live, and only one chance to save himself. He dropped the useless rifle and reached for his hunting knife, but his foot caught on a root and he stumbled. The blade flew from his grasp and disappeared into the underbrush with a metallic clatter. The bear hit him like a cannonball, driving him to the ground with bone-crushing force. They rolled through the leaves, man and beast, locked in a battle that could only end with one of them dead. Dick fought with everything he had, wrapping his arms around the creature's thick neck, dodging snapping jaws that could crush his skull like an eggshell. He drove his fist into the bear's snout, gouged at its eyes, kicked with all the power in his legs. The animal's breath was hot in his face, its roar like the sound of the earth splitting open. For long minutes they wrestled, neither able to gain the upper hand. Finally, with his strength nearly spent and darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision, Dick managed to hook his arm under the bear's throat. He squeezed with every ounce of power left in his body, cutting off the animal's air supply. The bear thrashed and clawed, but slowly, inevitably, its struggles grew weaker. At last, with a final shudder, it went limp. Dick lay beneath the dead weight for what felt like hours, too exhausted to move. When he finally crawled out from under the carcass, he was covered in blood, both his own and the bear's. His clothes hung in tatters, and deep scratches covered his arms and chest. But he was alive, and in the sandy basin, that was victory enough. These battles weren't just about survival. They were about something deeper, something that went to the very core of what it meant to be human in a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. Each fight, each narrow escape, each moment when death brushed past him like a cold wind was forging Dick into something extraordinary. The boy who had walked into the wilderness was disappearing, replaced by a man who feared nothing that walked, crawled, or flew. Word of his exploits began to filter back to civilization, carried by the occasional hunter brave enough to venture near the edges of his domain. They spoke in hushed tones of the boy who lived alone among the beasts, who fought bears with his bare hands and emerged victorious. Some called him crazy. Others whispered that he was touched by something supernatural. All agreed on one thing. Dick Colley was unlike any man they had ever known, but the wilderness held more secrets than Dick had yet discovered, and his greatest test was still to come. Years passed in this fashion, with Dick spending 9 months of each year alone in his mountain stronghold, returning to Reed's Valley only when spring arrived to replenish his supplies and satisfy his hunger for human company. These visits home became legendary affairs, for Dick's reputation as a fighter had grown beyond anything his family could have imagined. The saloons and gathering places of Reed's Valley would empty when word spread that fighting Dick Colley had come down from his mountain. Men who made their living with their fists, who feared no one in civilized company, would suddenly find urgent business elsewhere when Dick walked through the door. Those foolish enough to test him learned quickly why he had earned his fearsome nickname. His fists moved like hammers, each blow delivered with the crushing force of a man who had learned to fight for his very life. By the time Dick reached his 20th year, he had become something of a legend throughout the region. Stories of his battles with wild beasts grew with each telling, until some folks wondered if they were hearing truth or tall tales. But those who knew Dick understood that reality was often stranger than fiction when it came to the boy who had tamed the sandy basin. It was during this 20th year that Dick made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He chose to take a wife, a woman whose pioneer spirit matched his own. She was cut from the same cloth as the mountain women who had helped build America, strong enough to face hardship without flinching, brave enough to follow her man into the unknown. In 1825, Dick brought his bride to the cabin that had been his solitary fortress for nearly 2 decades. The wedding was a simple affair, conducted by a traveling preacher who had heard of Dick's legendary exploits. As the couple exchanged vows in the shadow of Pine Mountain, with only the forest creatures as witnesses, it seemed as though the wilderness itself was blessing their union. The woman who became Mrs. Colley understood what she was signing up for. She knew that their nearest neighbors lived 30 miles away over terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. She knew that their children would grow up in a world where danger lurked behind every tree. But she also knew that she was marrying a man unlike any other, someone who had carved civilization out of chaos through sheer force of will. Together, they would build something extraordinary in that remote valley, a legacy that would endure long after their bones had returned to the mountain soil they loved. The years that followed brought children to the Colley cabin, young ones who learned to walk on floors made from split logs and took their first steps in a world where panthers prowled and bears ruled the ridges. Dick raised a sheep on the mountain slopes, and his wife spun their wool into clothing that would protect their family through the harsh mountain winters. It was a hard life, but it was their life, and they wouldn't have traded it for all the comfort and safety that civilization could offer. Dick's children grew up hearing stories that would have terrified most youngsters, tales of their father's battles with creatures that haunted other children's nightmares. But to them, these were simply family history, proof that their papa was the strongest, bravest man who had ever lived. They learned to track and hunt almost before they could properly hold a rifle, understanding that in their world, such skills weren't hobbies, but necessities. The cabin itself became a symbol of human determination, triumphing over impossible odds. Visitors who made the treacherous journey to the sandy basin would stare in amazement at the simple structure that had become Dick's castle. 3 walls of massive logs, chinked tight against winter winds, with that famous open wall that had saved his life more times than anyone could count. Above the door hung trophies of his greatest victories, reminders of battles won and creatures conquered. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Dick Colley wasn't his strength or his courage or even his legendary fighting ability. It was his vision, his understanding that the world was changing and that he could play a part in shaping that change. As more settlers began to trickle into the region, drawn by stories of the man who had made the impossible seem routine, Dick welcomed them with open arms. He understood something that many frontiersmen didn't. The wilderness that had forged him, that had tested every fiber of his being and found him worthy, couldn't remain untouched forever. Progress was coming whether he liked it or not, and he could either fight it or help guide it. Dick chose to be a builder rather than an obstacle, a leader rather than a relic of a bygone age. The respect he commanded among the growing population was absolute. Men who had never backed down from a fight would tip their hats respectfully when Dick Colley passed by. Women would quiet their children with whispered reminders that Mr. Colley was someone special, someone to be admired and emulated. His word became law in disputes, his judgment sought in matters both large and small. But respect born of fear wasn't enough for Dick. He wanted something more lasting, something that would benefit not just his own family, but all the families who were brave enough to make their homes in this challenging land. He began to lobby the Virginia government, using his growing reputation to push for improvements that would connect the sandy basin to the wider world. The roads came first, snaking through mountain passes that had never known the wheel of a wagon. Dick personally guided the survey teams, showing them routes that only he knew, paths that wound through the wilderness like ribbons of possibility. These weren't just roads to him, they were lifelines, connections that would allow commerce and communication to flow between his mountain paradise and the civilization beyond. Schools followed the roads, one-room structures where mountain children could learn their letters and numbers. Churches rose in clearings that had once echoed only with the screams of panthers, their bell towers reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest. The wilderness was being tamed, not through violence or destruction, but through the steady application of human will and determination. Dick watched these changes with the satisfaction of a man who had played his part in something greater than himself. The boy who had walked alone into the darkness had become the father of a community, the architect of progress in a land that had once seemed beyond the reach of civilization. His children would grow up in a world he had helped create, a place where courage and determination still mattered, but where a man didn't have to fight bears with his bare hands to prove his worth. Yet even as the years passed and his hair began to show traces of silver, Dick Colley never lost the edge that had made him legendary. The wilderness had marked him permanently, shaped him into something that civilization could appreciate but never fully understand. He remained a man apart, someone who had seen the raw face of nature and emerged victorious. The stories of his exploits continued to grow and spread, carried by travelers and traders who had heard them from the mountain folk themselves. In an age when America was hungry for heroes, when the young nation needed legends to inspire its people, Dick Colley's tale struck a chord that resonated from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Here was proof that individual courage could triumph over any obstacle, that the human spirit could conquer even the most hostile environment. Newspapers began to pick up his story, though they often embellished details that were already larger than life. Writers compared him to Daniel Boone, to Davy Crockett, to all the legendary figures who had helped push America's frontier ever westward. But those who knew Dick personally understood that he was something unique, a man who had not just survived the wilderness, but had made it his own. As the 1850s dawned, Dick found himself looking back on a life that read like an adventure novel. The 13-year-old boy who had walked into certain death had become a man whose very name commanded respect throughout the region. The wilderness that had nearly killed him 1,000 times over had become his greatest teacher, his most cherished companion. But time, that great equalizer, was beginning to take its toll. The body that had wrestled bears and fought panthers was showing the accumulated wear of a lifetime spent in constant battle. The hands that had delivered knockout punches to grown men were starting to ache on cold mornings. The eyes that had spotted danger from impossible distances were beginning to require more light to read the newspaper. Dick accepted these changes with the same stoic courage he had shown throughout his life. He had never expected to grow old, had never imagined that he would live to see grandchildren playing in the yard where he had once fought for his life against wild beasts. Every day beyond his 13th birthday had been a gift, every year a bonus that few men in his position could have expected to claim. The community that had grown up around him continued to thrive, a testament to the vision of the man who had refused to let the wilderness defeat him. Roads connected the sandy basin to the wider world, bringing commerce and opportunity to places that had once known only isolation and danger. Schools and churches dotted the landscape, proof that civilization had taken root in soil watered by courage and determination. But perhaps Dick's greatest legacy wasn't the community he had helped build or the roads he had championed. It was the example he had set, the proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept limitations. In an America that was still defining itself, still discovering what it meant to be a nation of free people, Dick Colley represented something essential and irreplaceable. He was the embodiment of the American spirit, the living proof that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. His story had become part of the national mythology, a tale told around campfires and in parlors, a reminder that heroes weren't born, but made through trial and tribulation. As 1858 approached, Dick could look around the sandy basin with the satisfaction of a job well done. The wilderness that had once seemed unconquerable had been transformed into a thriving community. The boy who had feared nothing had become the man who had built something lasting, something that would endure long after he was gone. The mountains that had witnessed his greatest triumphs still rose majestically around the valley, their granite faces unchanged by the passage of time. But the land between them told a different story, one of human persistence and vision, of a single individual's refusal to accept defeat. Dick Colley had not just survived the wilderness, he had conquered it, not through destruction, but through transformation, turning a place of death into a cradle of life. The legend was nearly complete, but the final chapter was still to be written. On a quiet morning in the spring of 1858, as wildflowers painted the mountainsides in brilliant colors and the air carried the sweet scent of dogwood blossoms, Fighting Dick Colley drew his final breath in the land he had claimed as his own. The man who had walked into the wilderness as a boy and emerged as a legend passed away peacefully in the cabin he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the family he had raised and the community he had helped create. The news of his death spread through the mountains like wildfire, carried by riders who understood they were announcing the end of an era. In saloons, in general stores, around dinner tables and church gatherings, folks shared their memories of the man who had become larger than life. Some remembered the fearless boy who had answered Andrew Heburn's impossible challenge. Others recalled the fierce fighter whose reputation had grown with each passing year. All agreed that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would never come again. The funeral was unlike anything the Sandy Basin had ever seen. People came from hundreds of miles away, traveling over treacherous mountain roads to pay their respects to a man who had inspired them all. They came on horseback and on foot, in wagons loaded with entire families, all drawn by the need to say goodbye to someone who had shown them what was possible when courage met determination. The service was held in one of the churches Dick had helped establish, its wooden walls echoing with hymns sung by voices roughened by mountain air and the honest labor. The preacher spoke of a life well lived, of a man who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious not through luck or divine intervention, but through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief in himself. But the most fitting tribute came not from words, but from the land itself. As the mourners filed past Dick's coffin, they could see through the open church doors the community he had helped build. Roads wound through valleys where once only game trails had existed. Smoke rose from chimneys of cabins that housed families who had found hope and opportunity in a place that had once promised only death. Children played in schoolyards where panthers had once prowled, their laughter a testament to the transformation one man's courage had wrought. The burial took place on a hill overlooking the Sandy Basin, with a view that encompassed everything Dick had accomplished in his remarkable life. The granite headstone bore simple words that somehow captured the essence of an extraordinary man. Richard Colley, 1793-1858. He feared nothing. Below those words, carved deep into the mountain stone, was a single line that said everything that needed saying. First to enter, last to leave. As the years passed, and the story of Fighting Dick Colley spread far beyond the mountains where he had lived and died, something remarkable happened. The wilderness that had shaped him began to bear his name in ways both official and unofficial. Streams and ridges, hollows and gaps, all began to carry variations of the Colley name, as if the land itself was determined to remember the man who had first dared to call it home. The Virginia legislature, recognizing the role Dick had played in opening up the region and the respect he commanded among its people, made a decision that would ensure his legacy endured for generations to come. They renamed the entire area in his honor, creating Dickinson County, Virginia, a permanent monument to the boy who had walked alone into the darkness and emerged as the father of a community. Today, more than a century and a half after Dick Colley's death, visitors to Dickinson County can still see traces of the world he helped create. The roads he lobbied for still wind through mountain passes, though they're paved now and carry traffic he could never have imagined. The schools and churches he supported have been replaced by modern structures, but they serve the same purpose, educating children and nurturing souls in the tradition he established. The wilderness that once ruled the Sandy Basin has been tamed, its dangers reduced to memories and legends. Where panthers once screamed through the night, now only the occasional black bears reminds residents of the wild heritage of their land. The The forests that once seemed impenetrable have been opened by logging roads and hiking trails, making accessible to weekend adventurers what once challenged even the bravest pioneers. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Dick Colley's legacy isn't what has changed, but what has remained constant. The people of Dickinson County still possess something of the spirit that drove their legendary namesake into the wilderness all those years ago. They're still independent, still tough, still willing to face long odds with nothing but determination and grit. The blood of pioneers flows in their veins, passed down through generations, who understand that sometimes, when the world says something can't be done, the only proper response is to prove it wrong. In an age when heroes seem manufactured rather than forged, when courage is often confused with recklessness, and strength is measured in likes and shares rather than deeds and character, the story of Fighting Dick Colley serves as a reminder of what true heroism looks like. He wasn't fighting for fame or fortune, wasn't seeking to build a brand or gain followers. He was simply a boy who saw an impossible challenge and decided to meet it head on, consequences be damned. His story reminds us that America was built by individuals who refused to accept limitations, who looked at the impossible and saw only another obstacle to overcome. In an era when the nation was still defining itself, still discovering what it meant to be free, men like Dick Colley wrote the first chapters of the American dream with their blood, sweat, and unwavering determination. The 13-year-old boy who walked into the sandy basin carrying nothing but a rifle and an unshakable belief in himself became something far greater than he could have ever imagined. He became proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Today, as we face our own wilderness, our own seemingly impossible challenges, we would do well to remember the lesson of Fighting Dick Colley. The wilderness may have changed, the beasts we battle may be different, but the principles remain the same. Courage, determination, and an unshakable belief in the power of the human spirit can still move mountains, can still transform the impossible into the inevitable. The boy who feared nothing became the man who built everything, and in doing so, he showed us all what we're capable of when we refuse to accept defeat. In a world that often seems determined to convince us of our limitations, Dick Colley's story stands as eternal proof that the only limits that truly matter are the ones we accept for ourselves. The wilderness called, and one boy answered. In doing so, he didn't just change his own destiny, he changed the destiny of everyone who came after him, proving once and for all that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on grand stages before cheering crowds, but in lonely places where only God and the mountains bear witness to our courage. That, my friends, is the true story of Fighting Dick Colley, the boy who walked into legend and emerged as the father of a county. His name lives on in the mountains he loved, carved not just in stone, but in the very soul of the land he helped tame. And somewhere in those ancient hills, if you listen carefully on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, you might just hear the echo of his footsteps, still walking the ridges he claimed as his own, still watching over the community he died to create. This is the legacy of America's forgotten hero, the mountain man whose courage carved civilization from chaos, whose determination transformed death into life, and whose story reminds us all that sometimes, when the world says it can't be done, all it takes is one person willing to prove them wrong.